In the final decades of the 19th century, when the British Empire stretched across oceans and modern science promised to illuminate every corner of human knowledge, there remained pockets of England that seemed to belong to another century. Among the fog-draped hills of Somerset, tucked far from the smoke of the industrial cities, stood the sprawling Tallowby Estate, a labyrinth of gables, corridors, and shuttered windows that seemed almost to recoil from the outside world. Travelers passing along the winding country road rarely saw a candle flicker from its towers, and when they did, it only deepened the unease, as though someone, or something, was watching them from behind the glass. The Tallowbys were aristocrats of old lineage, the kind of family that could trace its name back to Norman conquests and whose wealth had once been synonymous with power. By the late 1800s, however, that power had become more insular. While neighboring manors opened their gates to modernization and progress, the Tallowbys seemed to resist the age. Their carriages remained horse-drawn long after rail lines stretched across the countryside. Their halls were lit by oil lamps while others installed gas and electric fixtures, and their family traditions, cloaked in ritual and secrecy, seemed relics of a darker medieval time. Locals whispered that the family was unwholesome, not in the ordinary sense of arrogance or excess, but in something deeper, something that unsettled the spirit. Servants who left their employment spoke of locked rooms and strange deliveries, but most curious of all were the disappearances. A farmhand gone missing after delivering hay, a peddler who never returned after being invited to rest in the estate's kitchen, a young maid dismissed without explanation, never to be seen again. None of these vanishings on their own would have been enough to stir alarm. But in the villages surrounding the Tallowby lands, the pattern became impossible to ignore. And then there were the rumors, strange, grotesque whispers that clung to the family name like ivy to stone. Deliveries made in the dead of night, wagons covered with tarps, unloading not food or firewood, but crates so heavy that 2 men were needed to lift them. The sight of Tallowby servants wheeling these crates down into the cellars beneath the manor, and always the faint metallic scent that lingered in the air afterward, a smell the villagers described as sharp, unnatural, almost like iron. Some claimed it was nothing more than superstition. After all, every reclusive family attracts stories, and few aristocrats were loved by the working classes. Yet there were those who swore the estate harbored something more. Children dared one another to creep up to the gates at night, and they would return pale, describing sounds from the house that no one could explain, the faint clatter of objects striking one another, hollow and rhythmic, as though stones or bones were being stacked in deliberate order. The word ossuary began to slip into hushed conversation, a word more at home in church catacombs than in the parlor of an English estate. To outsiders, such tales sounded fanciful, the fever dreams of a rural population prone to exaggeration. But as the 1890s waned, and as more names were added to the quiet roll of the missing, the rumors hardened into something closer to dread. Parish records began noting disappearances in guarded terms. Local priests began recording confessions that hinted at unnatural practices inside the Tallowby household. And when one of those priests, Father Malrick, wrote that the Tallowbys were building their own kingdom of bones, the phrase took on a life of its own. It was repeated in taverns, in farms, and in the marketplace, growing more sinister. Each time, what truth lay behind those walls? Why would a noble family, heirs to centuries of privilege, turn their inheritance into a mausoleum? Were they collectors in the morbid sense, antiquarians fascinated by relics of mortality? Or was it something more, something that required secrecy, silence, and sacrifice. That question hung in the air of Somerset like a fog that would not lift, and soon enough, events would force it into the open. The Tallowby name carried weight long before whispers of bones and vanished villagers. In the annals of English peerage, theirs was a family stitched tightly into the fabric of the realm. They had fought in wars, sat in parliament, and owned acres upon acres of fertile land. By the late 19th century, though, much of that glory had tarnished. The Industrial Revolution enriched new men of commerce, while ancient houses like the Tallowbys clung stubbornly to old wealth, old rituals, and old pride. To outsiders, the family appeared gilded but hollow, noble in title, decadent in practice, and increasingly detached from the world that modernity was reshaping. It was said that the estate itself mirrored their condition, grand, ornate, and impressive from a distance, but drafty, dim, and crumbling once one stepped inside. A portrait gallery displayed ancestors in heavy oils, stern-eyed knights, powdered courtiers, red-robed parliamentarians. But the Tallowbys of the 1890s were not warriors or statesmen. They were collectors, dabblers, and eccentrics, content to live among relics of the past rather than to shape the present. Their salons were filled with curiosities, taxidermied beasts from Africa, cabinets of geological samples, even a collection of death masks said to be acquired from the continent. At the heart of this eccentricity stood Lady Eleanor Tallowby. Widowed in her early 40s, she assumed the role of matriarch with an authority that few dared challenge. To the villagers, she was known only by glimpses, a tall figure in black veils, rarely seen in daylight, her carriage appearing at odd hours to fetch parcels from the train station. To those within her circle, however, she was a woman of formidable intellect and unnerving tastes. She wrote essays on antiquity, corresponded with scholars of medieval art, and amassed a personal library heavy with treatises on death, relics, and memento mori. It was Eleanor who first began the Tallowby obsession with human remains. While many aristocrats displayed skulls or bones as curiosities, souvenirs from battlefields or tokens of antiquarian study, Eleanor elevated the practice to something ritualistic. She spoke of bones not as remnants of decay, but as symbols of endurance, the architecture of existence, as she termed it. In her journals, later uncovered, she wrote that flesh deceives, but bone endures. To collect bone is to collect truth. Servants recalled the peculiar instructions she gave. Skulls were to be polished until they gleamed, vertebrae aligned as though in an anatomical study, femurs sorted by symmetry. What had begun as scattered oddities soon became a structured obsession. Each acquisition was catalogued, noted, and displayed, not in the grand halls, but in private rooms closed to all but the family. The more she withdrew from society, the more her influence deepened within the estate. Younger relatives, raised under her rule, absorbed her philosophy without question. Guests who attended rare dinners described how she would turn conversation to mortality, pressing her guests with unsettling questions. Do you know what remains when we are gone? What lasts when flesh has betrayed us? Some laughed nervously. Others left the estate with a chill that lingered. If the gilded portraits of her ancestors spoke of honor and public life, Lady Eleanor represented the family's darker inheritance, a fascination with what lies beneath the skin. In her hands, the Tallowby legacy began to shift, from noble service to the crown to an aristocracy of shadows, obsessed not with the living, but with the silent dominion of the dead. For centuries, the villages surrounding the Tallowby estate had lived in a kind of wary balance with the family. Farmers rented land from them, millers sold them grain, and tradesmen carried their wares through the estate gates. But by the 1890s, that balance had shifted. The estate was no longer a center of patronage and protection. It had become something darker, a place whose very name caused voices to lower and eyes to glance over shoulders. The first disappearances were subtle. A traveling tinker, last seen offering knives and pots at a cottage near the estate's borders. A widow's son who took employment as a scullery boy and never returned after being dismissed. A farmhand delivering hay to the stables who failed to come home for supper. Each case, taken alone, could be explained. Perhaps the tinker moved on to another town. Perhaps the boy ran away. Perhaps the farmhand drowned in one of the deep, treacherous marshes. But patterns have a way of emerging despite denial. By the mid-1890s, the parish priest had recorded no fewer than 9 disappearances in the vicinity of Tallowby lands. None of them involved gentry or landowners. They were always the vulnerable, the poor, the transient, those whose absence could be explained away with a shrug and a muttered word about bad luck. Yet the villagers remembered, and their memories began to knot into whispers. At the tavern hearths, the stories grew teeth. Men claimed they had seen carriages leaving the estate at odd hours, the wheels muffled, the horses dried, then hard toward the woods. Women swore they had glimpsed shapes in the windows, not the Tallowbys themselves, but figures pale and indistinct, as if something restless moved behind the curtains. Children invented rhymes. "Go to the gates and you won't come back. The Tallowbys keep you, bone and sack." What had begun as half-joking superstition began to feel like a warning. Those who worked on the estate grounds noticed things others ignored. Kitchen staff whispered that whole joints of meat arrived from the cellar with no record of a butcher's delivery. A gardener recalled how the soil behind the east wing always seemed freshly turned, though no seeds were planted there. A milkmaid reported hearing low scraping sounds echoing through the flagstones of the courtyard at night. She described it as like sticks rubbed together, or like someone piling bones. And then there were the deliveries. Carters spoke of being hired to haul heavy padlocked crates to the manor. Payment was generous but came with strict instructions. No questions, no lingering. One driver swore that when his wagon struck a rut, the lid of a crate shifted slightly, releasing a smell that made him retch. A metallic sour odor he later compared to the inside of a butcher's bucket. He never returned to Tallowby service again. Still, not all believed. Some dismissed it as peasant gossip, the envy of commoners toward aristocrats who lived in a crumbling grandeur beyond their reach. Superstition had always clung to the old families, they argued, and the Tallowbys were simply more reclusive than most. Others pointed out that the missing were exactly the kind of people who disappeared everywhere: drifters, servants, the poor. Why assume something unnatural? But disbelief could not erase fear. By 1897, travelers began avoiding the Tallowby Road at dusk, preferring longer routes to reach market towns. Mothers forbade children to wander near the estate walls. When storms rolled across the countryside, villagers said the lightning always struck closest to the Tallowby towers, as though even the heavens had marked them. The estate had become more than a manor house. It was spoken of as a hungry thing, an edifice that swallowed men whole and kept their traces locked in its stone belly. And though no one yet knew the truth, the whispers themselves created a shadow that spread further than the estate's walls. A question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. What exactly was happening inside the Tallowby Estate, and how many more would it take before someone dared to find out? Though the Tallowby Estate kept itself shrouded in secrecy, its walls were not completely impenetrable. Every so often, visitors of rank, Distant cousins, traveling noblemen, or curious antiquarians were invited to stay within its gloomy halls. And from those rare visits came glimpses, fragmented but persistent, of the family's unsettling preoccupation. One guest, a baronet's son from Bristol, recalled being shown to a drawing room whose mantelpiece bore not the usual porcelain figures or gilded clocks, but a pair of human femurs, crossed like sabers beneath a cracked family crest. When he laughed nervously and asked if they were replicas from an anatomical cabinet, Lady Eleanor reportedly replied, "Oh, no, these are authentic. Polish them, and you can still see where sinew once clung." He left the estate the next morning, declining breakfast. Another account came from a Belgian antiquarian who had been invited to appraise the family's medieval manuscripts. He described walking through a corridor lined with niches, each containing what he first assumed replaster casts of rib cages. On closer inspection, he realized they were no casts at all, but rib bones arranged artfully into symmetrical displays, their whiteness gleaming against the dark oak. He later wrote that the arrangement was too careful, too reverent to be mere curiosity. It was adoration. The servants, as ever, saw more. Housemaids whispered of locked wings of the mansion, sealed behind iron-banded doors to which only Lady Eleanor and her chosen heirs carried keys. When the family retired to those wings, sounds would sometimes drift into the main corridors. The metallic clink of tools, the dragging of heavy objects, and, most disturbing of all, what one maid swore was the hollow clatter of skulls being stacked one upon another. She confided in the village priest, but begged him not to reveal her name. "They would make me one of them," she reportedly said, her voice trembling. More curious still were the dinners. Guests spoke of table centerpieces fashioned from polished vertebrae strung together like garlands, or goblets mounted upon bone stems. To some, it seemed like grotesque novelty, a fashionable eccentricity taken too far. But those who lingered longer at the estate noticed that Lady Eleanor spoke of these objects with an almost sacred reverence. "Bone is the truth that remains," she would murmur, tracing a finger along a skull as if it were marble sculpture. Even more troubling was her insistence on cataloging. Several guests noted how she recorded each piece in a ledger, her pen scratching away between courses, noting dates, origins, and measurements. This was no random hoard of curiosities. It was the meticulous curation of a collector or a worshipper. By the late 1890s, whispers had spread beyond the villages into nearby towns. Traders who delivered to the estate returned with stories of seeing servants carrying long bundles wrapped in linen shaped unmistakably like limbs. Coachmen joked, though uneasily, that the Tallowbys had turned their manor into a church of bones. And though most dismissed these accounts as exaggeration, a pattern was emerging, one impossible to ignore. This was no longer mere eccentricity, nor even morbid aristocratic amusement. Something deeper, darker, was taking shape within those shuttered halls. A private collection that was not only growing, but being tended like a garden. A collection that seemed to demand secrecy, ritual, and perhaps new additions. Among the many whispers that swirled about the Tallowby Estate, none carried more weight than the story of the missing stable hands. It was, for many in Somerset, the moment when rumor hardened into certainty. Until then, the disappearances had been scattered, deniable. But in the summer of 1889, two young men vanished within days of one another, both employed directly under the Tallowby crest, and the way the family responded left little room for doubt. Their names were Thomas Hargreaves and Edwin Pike. Both were in their late teens, both the sons of tenant farmers who had long supplied labor to the estate. Thomas was known as a quiet but diligent worker, quick with horses and often praised by his employers. Edwin was more boisterous, fond of tavern laughter, but no less skilled in handling the spirited thoroughbreds the Tallowbys kept in their private stables. The two were friends, often seen together at the smithy or playing cards in the back of the inn. On the morning of July 14th, Thomas left his family cottage to deliver feed to the stables. He was expected home by dusk. When he failed to appear, his father assumed he had been kept late with chores. But when no word came by the following morning, concern turned to fear. His parents sent word to the estate, only to be told that Thomas had taken leave without notice. The phrasing struck them as odd. Thomas was loyal, and nothing in his demeanor suggested a sudden departure. Before the family could press the issue further, disaster struck again. 2 days later, Edwin Pike vanished. He had been seen entering the stable yard at noon, carrying a bucket of water. By evening, no trace of him remained. When his brothers went to inquire, they too were given the same line. Edwin had apparently left service of his own accord, no explanation given. The repetition was uncanny, as though the statement had been prepared. The village was shaken. 2 young men, both hale and strong, both devoted to their families, disappearing without warning within the same week. Mothers forbade their sons from seeking work at the manor, and whispers spread that the estate itself had consumed them. It was the parish priest, Father Malrick, who took the matter most seriously. In his diary, a record later pored over by magistrates and scholars alike, he noted the strangeness of the Tallowby response. Within days of the disappearances, both families were offered compensation. Bags of coin, far more generous than typical wages, were delivered quietly to the parents with solemn assurances that their sons had gone to seek better fortunes elsewhere. Most striking of all was the speed. The Tallowbys seemed ready with payment almost before questions could be asked. Father Malrick wrote, "It is as though the house has rehearsed this moment. They do not search. They do not grieve. They only silence. What cause can there be, unless they know more than they say?" The priest urged the families not to accept the money. But poverty has its own weight, and in the end, both households took the coin, though the bitterness remained. To them, it felt less like aid and more like purchase. A way of buying silence, of erasing 2 young men from the parish rolls. As weeks turned to months, unease in the countryside deepened. The names Thomas Hargreaves and Edwin Pike became talismans of fear. At market, mothers would lower their voices when speaking of them, glancing toward the manor's distant towers as if afraid of being overheard. The boys' companions muttered that they had seen fresh soil piled high near the eastern orchard, though none dared investigate further. The disappearances, and the suspicious haste with which they were resolved, marked a turning point. The villagers no longer spoke of mere eccentricity. They began to speak of menace, of a family whose wealth allowed them to cover sins too dreadful to admit. And beneath it all lay the priest's words, preserved in neat ink across brittle pages. "This house feasts upon its servants, and what is feasted upon cannot return." Among the scraps of testimony that survive regarding the Tallowby Estate, few are as chilling or as credible as the correspondence of Lord Arthur Whitcomb. A minor nobleman from Surrey, Whitcomb was no village gossip or superstitious farmhand. He was educated at Oxford, widely traveled, and known for his sharp observations of the world around him. When he visited the Tallowbys in the autumn of 1890, it was to discuss a potential marriage alliance with one of Eleanor's nieces. What he encountered instead left him shaken, and in a letter written to his brother, he captured details that would later be used as evidence against the family. The letter begins cordially enough. Whitcomb describes the estate as vast but melancholy, its towers shrouded in ivy, its corridors echoing with drafts. He remarks on the oddity of its dim lighting. Candles where gas should be, lamps where the electric ought to shine, and the strangeness of the servants, who seemed almost rehearsed in their movements, rarely speaking except in hushed tones. But soon his tone shifts. He writes of being kept in a guest chamber not far from the east wing. At night, when the house fell silent, he began to hear noises that did not belong to any manor he had ever visited. It was a sound as of stones tumbling in a quarry, or of billiard balls striking, but hollow, sharper, more dreadful. I swear to you, Henry, it was the clattering of bones, not a metaphor, but the unmistakable rattle of dry remains handled by human hands. The second incident he describes was even more disturbing. Taking a solitary walk one afternoon, he strayed into a lower passage near the kitchens. There, at the end of a dim corridor, he found a heavy oak door barred with iron. Carved into its surface were marks, deep and deliberate, crude symbols, crosses slashed through circles, and tally-like scratches running in columns. Whitcomb, a student of antiquities, compared them to ossuary notations he had once seen in Prague, where bones were stored in crypts and catalogued by the hundreds. It was not the work of idle vandalism, he wrote, but a system of reckoning etched by those who keep count of what they hoard. His unease deepened with each passing day. Meals were strained affairs, presided over by Lady Eleanor, who spoke often of mortality and legacy, unsettling topics for what was supposed to be a courtship visit. On his third and final night, Whitcomb claimed he heard a long dragging sound beneath the floorboards of his chamber, as though something heavy were being pulled across stone. He did not sleep again until dawn. The letter ends abruptly with a decision. He would depart immediately, citing ill health as an excuse. I tell you, Henry, there is sickness here, but not of the flesh. Something festers in those walls, something that rattles by night and scratches its marks into doors. I will not stay to see what lies beyond them. Though the letter was not made public until years later, when it was produced in the wake of the Tallowby investigation, it stands today as one of the earliest first-hand accounts to suggest that the whispers of an ossuary within the estate were more than idle fantasy. For Lord Whitcomb, the house had revealed just enough to send him fleeing, and to plant in the historical record a testimony that would haunt the Tallowby legacy forever. By the spring of 1892, the whispers "Sir" rounding the Tallowby estate had grown so insistent that even the bravest of the villagers avoided its grounds. Yet fear has a way of breaking when desperation intervenes, and it was desperation that pushed a group of men to trespass upon the estate's borders one moonless night. The spark came from the disappearance of William Carter, a boy of only 12 years, last seen chasing a runaway lamb near the orchard fences. His family searched the fields, the hedgerows, even the riverbank, but no trace could be found. Whispers turned, as always, toward the looming manor on the hill. Some urged silence. What good could come of angering the Tallowbys? But the boy's father would not be soothed. He gathered a handful of neighbors and swore they would search the estate grounds, permission or none. It was after midnight when the group, 6 men in all, crept through the gaps of the crumbling stone wall. They carried lanterns muffled in cloth, their boots sinking into wet earth as they moved across the fields. The estate loomed above them, its windows dark, the silhouette of its chimneys like blackened fingers clawing at the night sky. At first, all was silent save the rustle of branches and the pounding of their own hearts. Then, as they neared the eastern side of the manor, they heard it. A low, hollow thud, distant but distinct, rising from beneath their feet. They stopped in their tracks, straining to listen. Again it came. A thump, then another, followed by a sound like objects clattering together, brittle, echoing, unnatural. One man later compared it to a sack of antlers dropped upon stone. Another said it was like the rattling of bones being poured from a basket. They followed the sound to a sunken courtyard where ivy choked the stones and half-buried doors led down into the cellars. One door in particular bore iron hinges as thick as a man's wrist, the wood scarred and patched where bolts had been replaced. From behind it came the noises, thuds, scrapes, the faint clink of metal against bone. The men dared not break the door, but they pressed their ears to the wood, listening in horror as the sounds continued. They swore they heard dragging, as though something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Once, unmistakably, there was a sharp, hollow knock, like a skull striking stone. The boy's father whispered his son's name through the crack, his voice trembling. No answer came, but the noises ceased, leaving a silence more dreadful than the sounds themselves. One of the group insisted on leaving at once, convinced they were trespassing on something unholy. Another spat on the ground, declaring that the Tallowbys had sealed the boy below. They argued in hushed tones, but fear triumphed. With no tools to force entry and the certainty that discovery would bring swift retribution, they withdrew into the night, their lanterns bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps as they fled back to the village. The next morning, the boy's father went to the parish priest, Father Malrick, and told him everything. Malrick recorded the account in his diary with grim precision. They heard the bones, not a metaphor, not a turn of speech, but the clatter of bones handled by the living. It is my belief the child is within those walls, though his voice has been silenced. News of the incursion spread quietly but swiftly through the countryside. Though the men tried to keep their secret, word slipped, as it always does. Soon the taverns buzzed with retellings, each more lurid than the last. Some claimed the men had glimpsed piles of skulls through cracks in the door. Others insisted they had heard muffled cries before the silence fell. Whatever the embellishments, the core remained. Ordinary villagers had gone to the estate and returned with terror in their eyes. The effect was immediate. Mothers clutched their children closer. Laborers refused work on the estate grounds, even when wages were doubled. A superstition took root that to walk too near the cellar walls was to hear the dead calling, not in words, but in the dreadful chorus of their bones. For the first time, the whispers had become more than rumor. There was now an encounter, unverified, yes, but witnessed by multiple men whose reputations for honesty stood firm. The boy was never found, and the family eventually left Somerset altogether, but the tale of what the villagers heard that night endured. It was, in their eyes, the first true proof that the Tallowby Estate was not merely eccentric or haunted by coincidence. It was a place of deliberate, constructed horror, and its cellar was the mouth of that abyss. By 1894, the whispers could no longer be contained within the hedgerows and taverns of Somerset. Too many disappearances had been linked. Too many servants had slipped fragments of confession, and Father Malrick's diary entries had found their way into the hands of the diocesan authorities. Pressure mounted until the magistrates of the county had no choice but to act. On an overcast morning in October, a small detachment of constables, accompanied by 2 magistrates and a church-appointed observer, rode up the gravel drive of the Tallowby Estate. The official warrant they carried was framed around suspected, improper burials and concealment of deaths, a cautious legal phrasing that betrayed how little the authorities truly knew, or dared to claim. The Tallowbys, ever coldly courteous, received the men at the door. Lady Eleanor herself greeted them, veiled and composed, her voice calm as she invited them into the grand hall. She offered tea, as if the intrusion were a mere formality, but her refusal to leave their company was telling. She lingered at every threshold, her presence a subtle barrier. It was only when the constables produced the warrant and insisted on access to the cellars that her mask flickered. For the briefest instant, one observer swore he saw the tightening of her jaw, the hardening of her eyes. The search began in the kitchens and storerooms, turning up nothing unusual save for a faint odor that seemed to linger in the air, metallic and sour. It was when the party reached the eastern wing, to the heavy oak doors reported by Lord Whitcomb years before, that events took their dreadful turn. The door was barred, its lock unusually elaborate, reinforced by iron bolts. Lady Eleanor declined to provide a key, claiming it was a private archive. The magistrates, unmoved, ordered it forced. With the swing of a hammer and the splinter of wood, the door gave way. What lay beyond it has been described in multiple official reports, each account grimly consistent. The chamber stretched wide beneath the manor, its vaulted ceiling supported by pillars of rough-hewn stone. And from those pillars, from the walls, from every alcove and niche, protruded bones. Skulls, femurs, ribs, vertebrae, all arranged in precise order, stacked and mortared as though the chamber itself had been constructed out of human remains. Some walls were lined entirely with skulls, eye sockets staring out like hollow witnesses. Others bore femurs placed crosswise in careful lattice, forming grotesque patterns that mirrored ecclesiastical ossuaries found on the continent. But here, the arrangement lacked reverence. It was not memorial. It was display. On long oak tables stood rows of bones sorted by size and shape. Skulls of children, no larger than a man's palm, placed beside those of adults, their crowns polished to a gleam. A collection of ribs had been wired together to form circular ornaments like grotesque wreaths. Finger bones were strung into chains that hung from hooks, rattling softly as the magistrate's lantern stirred the stale air. One constable, hardened by years of service, is said to have dropped his lamp and vomited when he realized what he was seeing. Another crossed himself repeatedly, muttering prayers under his breath. Even the magistrates, men not prone to superstition, admitted to being shaken to their core. And still, there was more. In the farthest alcove, they found what appeared to be a workbench. Upon it lay tools, saws, knives, files, stained dark with age. Nearby, ledgers bound in leather, their pages filled with notations in Lady Eleanor's precise hand. Measurements, dates, names reduced to initials. Each entry corresponded to a set of bones, catalogued as if they were specimens in a natural history museum. The Church Observer, a canon from Bath, later wrote, "I had believed myself prepared for horrors, yet I confess I trembled as though the ground itself had given way. This was no collection of curios, but a system, an order, a harvest of humanity stored as though for eternity." Word of the discovery spread quickly, despite the Tallowby's attempts to suppress it. Constables spoke to their wives, servants whispered to neighbors. By the week's end, half of Somerset buzzed with the story of the chamber beneath the manor. And as details spilled, the skull-lined walls, the chains of finger bones, the ledgers of the dead, the whispers hardened into certainty. The Tallowbys had built their own ossuary, not as a place of reverence, but as a vault of obsession. For centuries, aristocrats had collected art, relics, and trophies. But the Tallowbys had gone further. They had turned death itself into their gallery, and in doing so, they had revealed to the world not simply eccentricity, but something far darker. An aristocratic family who had crossed the line between collector and butcher, between curiosity and desecration. The ossuary chamber was no longer rumor. It was fact, sealed into the official records of Somerset, its description etched into testimonies that would haunt the county for generations. What remained unanswered, however, was the question that loomed in every villager's mind. Whose bones filled those walls, and how many of the missing had been reduced to, catalogue, entries in Lady Eleanor's ledger. If the chamber itself was enough to horrify, it was the discovery of the ledger that transformed the Tallowby case from rumor into something far darker, something undeniable. On the workbench in the eastern alcove, bound in cracked leather and mottled with age, lay a heavy book. Its cover bore no title, only the impression of use, corners worn, spines softened by repeated handling. When the magistrates opened it, they expected perhaps an account book, a list of purchases or rents. Instead, they found page after page of neat, unwavering handwriting. Lady Eleanor's hand, identified by multiple servants. The contents chilled them more than the walls of skulls ever could. Each entry followed a meticulous pattern. At the top of the page, a number, sequential. Below it, details that read not like commerce, but like anatomy. Specimen 117, male, approximate age, 35, skull, brachycephalic, mandible strong, vertebrae intact, slight curvature, notes, fine symmetry. Specimen 134, female, approximate age, 19, skull narrow, dentition poor, femurs intact, tibiae broken during extraction. Notes, fragile bone quality. Specimen 142, juvenile, approximate age, 7, skull near perfect, ribs small, fragile. Notes, retained in full for display wreath. The magistrates turned page after page, their horror mounting with every line. This was not random grave robbing, nor the idle eccentricity of a noble family fascinated with memento mori. This was cataloguing, deliberate and clinical. Each set of bones had been examined, measured, and judged for its quality, as though Lady Eleanor were curating a collection of gemstones rather than human remains. Most disturbing of all was the tallying. Margins were marked with symbols, cross-references, and occasional notations about placement within the chamber. Skulls with aesthetic appeal were listed for display niches, while lesser bones were relegated to supporting walls. The precision spoke of obsession, a mind not only comfortable with death, but devoted to shaping it into order. Some pages contained remarks that revealed Eleanor's philosophy more starkly than any journal entry. Next to one specimen, she wrote, "Perished in service but not lost, his structure remains loyal." For another, "Fragile yet preserved, proof that even the smallest body holds eternal strength." It was as if she viewed the bones not as remnants of once living people, but as raw material. Objects to be processed, catalogued, and arranged into a vision of permanence. One constable who handled the book later confessed that the ledger unnerved him more than the chamber itself. The bones could be madness, he said, but the book was method, madness with a ruler and ink. For investigators, the ledger became both a roadmap and an accusation. Though many of the names of the missing could not be matched to the entries, most were reduced to initials or crude descriptors. There were enough correlations to confirm suspicions. Several entries listed dates that coincided precisely with parish records of disappearances. Specimen 119, male, 18, dated July 1889, matched almost perfectly the vanishing of Edwin Pike, one of the stable hands. Another, specimen 120, male, 19, was recorded only days later, aligning with the disappearance of Thomas Hargreaves. The ledger had done what no whisper, rumor, or even chamber of bones could do alone. It provided proof of a system, proof that the Tallowbys had not stumbled into atrocity, but embraced it with deliberation, proof that each disappearance had been measured and filed away like the page of a ledger. When news of the book's contents leaked, it spread even faster than the tale of the ossuary chamber. People could dismiss bones as relics, as thefts from ancient graves, as grotesque but explainable. But the ledger, with its precise script and chilling regularity, robbed them of that comfort. This was not theft. It was not eccentricity. It was record-keeping. And record-keeping meant ownership. Someone, after all, had cared enough to ensure nothing was forgotten. The villagers who had long whispered about the estate found their darkest fears confirmed. The Tallowbys were not merely collectors. They were archivists of death, guardians of a catalog that reduced human life to bone and ink. If the ossuary chamber revealed the scope of the Tallowbys' obsession and the ledger revealed its order, it was the writings of Lady Eleanor herself that revealed its soul. Among the papers seized from her private library were notebooks bound in calfskin, their margins filled with dense looping script. These journals, later read aloud in court, offered a glimpse into the mind that had shaped one of the darkest legacies in English aristocracy. Lady Eleanor's writings began innocuously enough. Early entries spoke of her grief after the death of her husband, Lord Alistair Tallowby, in 1878. She described the empty corridors, the silence of her chambers, the sense that life had been stripped of its permanence. "Flesh betrays us," she wrote. "It decays, it lies, it abandons. But when the flesh is gone, the truth is revealed. Bone remains faithful." That phrase, "bone remains faithful," would repeat throughout her writings like a refrain, a mantra that anchored her evolving philosophy. To her, bones were not grim reminders of mortality, but emblems of endurance, the scaffolding of the human spirit. "Marble cracks," she wrote. "Iron rusts, but bone abides. To possess it is to hold what time itself cannot erase." It was from this foundation that her ideology began to warp. Eleanor wrote that bones carried not just endurance but essence. She described them as vessels of legacy, repositories of identity that outlived the frailty of flesh. The shape of a skull tells the story of a mind. The curve of a femur recalls a lifetime of steps. In bone, eternity is written. To her, preserving bones was more than an act of collection. It was an act of dominion. By arranging, cataloging, and ordering the remains of others, she believed she could command their essence, bending mortality into permanence. She compared her ossuary to a library, a place where the texts of human lives could be curated and preserved. "Each skeleton is a book," she declared, "and I am its keeper." Her journals also revealed how she justified the family's role in these practices. She wrote that common people passed through the world unremembered, their names forgotten within a generation. But by claiming their bones, by giving them place and order in her ossuary, she believed she was elevating them into eternity. In her eyes, the poor and the transient were not victims but beneficiaries, granted a form of permanence they could never have achieved in life. "They were nothing in flesh," she scrawled in one passage, "but in bone, they are eternal." The moral violation of this logic is obvious. What Eleanor saw as a gift was in truth desecration of the highest order. Yet to read her words is to understand how she rationalized acts that would horrify anyone else. Her tone was not wild or frenzied. It was calm, meticulous, and assured. She wrote not as a fanatic, but as a scholar, penning essays on the sanctity of bone with the same detached authority as an antiquarian cataloging artifacts. One entry in particular struck investigators as chilling. It read, "A family that binds its legacy in land may lose it. A family that binds its legacy in wealth may squander it. But a family that binds its legacy in bone shall endure until the marrow of the earth is dry." Through such words, her vision extended beyond personal obsession. She cast the ossuary as the foundation of a new dynasty, one not measured in titles or estates, but in the physical permanence of the dead. To her heirs she wrote instructions, urging them to continue the work, to expand the collection, to ensure that the Tallowby name became synonymous not with flesh and frailty, but with bone and eternity. For the magistrates and priests who later pored over these writings, the fear was not merely of what had been done, but of what such an ideology could inspire if left unchecked. This was not madness in the sense of incoherence. It was a complete philosophy, a worldview that transformed atrocity into duty, desecration into honor. That calmness, that chilling rationality, was what unsettled readers most. Lady Eleanor Tallowby had built more than an ossuary. She had built an ideology of bone, one that justified the silencing of voices, the disappearance of neighbors, and the cataloging of lives reduced to skeleton and script. She believed she had outwitted decay, that by turning people into artifacts, she had robbed death of its sting. In truth, she had only corrupted it, and in so doing, revealed how far the human mind can wander when it seeks eternity in the remains of others. With the ossuary chamber uncovered and Lady Eleanor's writings in hand, authorities turned to those who had lived and worked within the estate. If the journals revealed the mind of the matriarch, then the servants and relatives could reveal how her philosophy had been carried out. The testimonies that followed were a mixture of silence, denial, and reluctant confession. Many of the household staff swore they knew nothing. Footmen claimed they were never allowed near the eastern cellars. Housemaids insisted they believed the locked doors led only to wine vaults. Cooks said their duties kept them to the kitchens and gardens, far from the family's private wings. These denials were convenient, but not convincing. Too many details from other witnesses contradicted them. One former scullery maid, dismissed years before, spoke in trembling tones of being ordered to polish skulls until they shone. She described how the bones were carried upstairs in linen sacks, placed before her on a table, and handed rags and oils with curt instructions, "See that they gleam." When she protested, she said Lady Eleanor's niece reminded her that the family pays well for obedience. The maid later confessed she still dreamt of the hollow eye sockets following her every move. A gardener offered another detail. While tending the estate's hothouse, he recalled being summoned to carry bundles into the cellar. Bundles, too, were unmistakably shaped like torsos and limbs, wrapped tight in coarse cloth. When he asked what they were, a steward replied sharply, "Mannequins, for study." Yet the weight, the smell, and the silence that followed told him otherwise. He fled the estate not long after, never daring to speak until called before the magistrates. Even among distant relatives, complicity crept into the record. A cousin who had stayed at the estate for several months admitted he once dined with Eleanor and her heirs in a private parlor where the centerpiece was a skull carved with intricate designs. He swore it was just a curiosity and insisted he had no part in the family's peculiar amusements. But under questioning, he conceded that he had seen ledgers being updated and that he knew full well they contained not financial accounts, but something unwholesome. The most damning testimony came from a chambermaid named Margaret, who claimed she had been forced to dust displays in the private gallery. She described rib cages arranged like wreaths and finger bones linked into chains. When she once hesitated, Lady Eleanor herself reportedly told her, "Do not shrink, girl. You dust portraits of the dead with no complaint. These are only portraits in bone." Not every witness was so forthcoming. Some remained steadfastly loyal, insisting the accusations were slander, inventions of envious villagers. Others admitted strange practices but argued they were harmless eccentricities, nothing more than the morbid interests of an aristocratic family that did not conform to social taste. But taken together, the testimonies painted a pattern too consistent to ignore. The staff had been not only aware, but in many cases coerced into participation. Whether they polished, carried, or dusted, they became silent accomplices in the construction of the ossuary. The effect on the court of inquiry was profound. What had seemed at first like the obsession of one woman began to appear as something broader, a culture of complicity within the Tallowby household. The family had not acted in isolation. They had enlisted, coerced, and silenced those around them. The ossuary was not the work of one pair of hands. It was a system, and systems always require many to sustain them. The trial of the Tallowby family was unlike any proceeding Somerset had ever seen. Held in the county assizes of Taunton in the winter of 1895, it drew crowds from across the region, filling galleries with villagers, reporters, and curious onlookers who had traveled by train and coach to witness what the newspapers dubbed the Ossuary case. From the outset, the prosecution faced a formidable challenge. The Tallowbys were not paupers or itinerants to be easily condemned. They were members of the landed gentry, their name linked to centuries of service in Parliament and the Crown. Their wealth was vast, their influence broad, and their defense team among the most skilled barristers available in London. At first, it seemed entirely possible that money and prestige would shield them, as it had shielded so many others. The charges, however, were damning. The family stood accused of grave robbing, the concealment of deaths, unlawful burials, and, though the evidence was more circumstantial, the suspected murder of servants and villagers whose bones had been catalogued in Lady Eleanor's ledger. Added to these secular charges was a more spiritual accusation, blasphemy, for desecrating the human body in ways that the Church declared an affront to God's natural order. The defense sought to discredit the evidence. They argued that the bones found in the chamber were ancient relics, gathered from churchyards with permission or purchased through collectors on the continent. The ledger, they claimed, was nothing more than a scholarly exercise in anatomical notation. As for the servants' testimonies, the defense dismissed them as exaggerations, the fancies of simple minds corrupted by village superstition. Yet the prosecution was relentless. They presented Father Malrick's diary, its entries meticulously recording each disappearance and his mounting suspicions. They brought forth the gardener, the chambermaid, and the dismissed scullery maid, whose trembling voices recounted their forced labors polishing skulls and dusting rib cages. They read aloud excerpts from Lady Eleanor's journals, including the chilling line, "A family that binds its legacy in bone shall endure until the marrow of the earth is dry." Perhaps most damning of all were the correlations between the ledger and the missing. The prosecutor held aloft the book, turning its pages for the jury to see, and pointed to entries dated precisely in line with known disappearances: Thomas Hargreaves, Edwin Pike, and others. Though initials replaced names, the ages, dates, and descriptions were too exact to dismiss as coincidence. The courtroom grew hushed as this evidence was laid bare. Even the reporters, eager for sensationalism, described an atmosphere less of excitement than of dread. One wrote, "It was as though the air itself recoiled from the words spoken, as if in that chamber we too stood among the bones." Lady Eleanor remained composed throughout, her black veil unshaken, her posture regal. When questioned directly, she neither admitted nor denied the charges, instead delivering cryptic remarks that unsettled even the judge. Asked why she had kept such a collection, she replied, "I kept nothing. I preserved what would otherwise be squandered. In time, you will see it as I do." Her heirs and relatives were less controlled. Some wept, some denied all knowledge, some sought to place blame entirely on Eleanor. But the pattern of evidence was too strong, and the public too outraged. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Their verdict was uneven. For while direct charges of murder could not be proved beyond doubt, grave robbing, unlawful concealment, and blasphemous desecration were declared beyond question. Lady Eleanor herself was sentenced to life confinement in an asylum for the criminally insane. Several of her heirs received prison terms of varying length, while others, their complicity less direct, were stripped of inheritance and exiled from Somerset. The outcome satisfied few entirely. To some, it was too lenient. After all, how many lives had been stolen? How many families left without closure? To others, it was astonishing that a family of such status had faced conviction at all. In taverns and churches alike, the refrain was the same. If the bones had not been found, she would have walked free. What the trial achieved most of all was the cementing of the Tallowby legend. No longer mere rumor, no longer whispered suspicion. Their atrocities had been laid bare in open court, recorded in transcripts and printed in broadsheets from London to Edinburgh. The name that had once stood for nobility now conjured images of skull-lined chambers and ledgers of the dead. The Tallowbys had sought eternity in bone. Instead, they found it in infamy. Though the trial of the Tallowbys brought what many believed was long-awaited justice, there was one shadow that no verdict could dispel. For amid the arrests, the interrogations, and the formal sentencing, whispers persisted that not all of the family had been accounted for. The name most often spoken in hushed tones was that of Richard Tallowby, Lady Eleanor's youngest grandson. Barely 20 at the time of the raid, Richard had always lingered at the edges of the family, neither heir to the estate nor directly involved in its affairs. Yet several servants later testified that Richard was seen often in the eastern wing, carrying books and supplies into the locked cellars, speaking in low tones with Eleanor herself. When constables swept the estate in 1894, Richard was nowhere to be found. His chamber was stripped of personal belongings, and no record of his whereabouts could be produced by the family. Some insisted he had fled days before the search began, warned by Eleanor or another relative that discovery was imminent. Others claimed he had slipped away during the confusion of the raid, vanishing into the woods that bordered the estate. What gave the rumors greater weight was the discovery of absence. Not only was Richard missing, but so too were several items from the ossuary chamber. In one alcove, magistrates noted gaps in the arrangement, spaces where skulls had clearly been removed. In another, a ledger was found with its pages torn out, as if someone had deliberately stripped it of names or notations. The inventory of remains, already incomplete, now carried silent erasures. Even more unsettling were reports that surfaced months later. A pair of travelers claimed to have encountered a pale young man aboard a train bound for the coast, a man who carried a trunk he guarded with unusual intensity. They described the faint smell of earth and mildew seeping from its seams. When asked his name, he gave only R. Tallowby. Whether this was truth or coincidence, none could prove. Years later, in 1901, a small ossuary-like arrangement was discovered in an abandoned chapel near Calais, bones arranged with a precision that recalled the Somerset chamber. French authorities dismissed it as the work of grave robbers, but English newspapers could not resist drawing the connection. Had Richard fled across the Channel, continuing the work his grandmother began? The ambiguity left the public restless. In taverns, people swore that Richard had carried away the choicest skulls, those Eleanor deemed most perfect. Parents warned children that the Tallowby's heir still walked the earth, arching for bones to add to his inheritance. Every unexplained disappearance in the counties bordering Somerset was, for a time, attributed to the escaped grandson. For historians, the missing heir remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the case. No body was ever found, no record of his death entered into official ledgers. His name simply dissolved from the rolls of the living, leaving behind a blank space as haunting as the empty niches in the ossuary walls. And it is in that absence that fear thrives. Because while Lady Eleanor's ideology had been exposed and condemned, Richard represented the possibility of its survival. If even a fragment of the collection left the estate in his care, then the Tallowby obsession was not buried by the trial. It was scattered, waiting to resurface, hidden in trunks, cellars, or forgotten chapels. In the end, the trial closed a chapter, but it did not close the book. Somewhere beyond the reach of the magistrates, an heir to the ossuary walked free, and with him walked the chilling possibility that the Tallowby legacy, a legacy built in bone, was not ended, but simply waiting. When the doors of the ossuary chamber were finally thrown open to the public record, the first to arrive were not magistrates or reporters, but the families of the missing. Word spread quickly through the villages. Mothers, fathers, widows, and siblings came clutching parish notes, desperate for answers. They crowded the courthouse steps and the grounds outside the estate, each hoping that some fragment of bone, some faint mark, might allow them to claim the remains of those they had lost. But the reality was cruel. The bones inside the Tallowby chamber bore no names, no personal tokens, no clear markers of identity. Where Lady Eleanor's ledger recorded details, it did so clinically. Male, 20 years, skull strong. Female, 18, fragile ribs. The individuality of the dead had been erased, reduced to measurements and notes on symmetry. For the grieving, this meant there could be no certainty, only speculation. One mother, whose son had vanished while working in the stables, is said to have begged the magistrates to let her hold a particular skull, insisting she would know the shape of his brow. She was denied, the officials explaining that all evidence must remain preserved. She collapsed on the steps, her cries echoing across the courtyard. Another family, searching for a daughter who had gone missing after seeking employment as a maid, found themselves staring at a row of small bones catalogued as juvenile specimens. They left the estate in silence, their grief too deep even for words. Some bones, too decomposed or incomplete to be catalogued, were collected into crates and sent away. A portion of them were buried in communal graves by church decree, though without markers or names. Others, disturbingly, were handed to antiquarians and scholars who sought to study the peculiar ossuary practices of Somerset. Within a generation, fragments from the Tallowby chums had appeared in museum cabinets under vague labels, unattributed remains, 19th century England. For visitors, they were curiosities. For the families, they were desecrated relics of loved ones denied even the dignity of rest. The emotional fallout was profound. Villagers spoke of a curse upon the land, claiming that crops failed near the estate and livestock grew restless when driven past its gates. Families who had lost kin carried that grief for decades, their names etched in parish rolls with the bitter annotation, "disappeared." Worse still was the sense of betrayal. The Tallowbys had been aristocrats, patrons of the very people they preyed upon. To many, it was not merely the crime of one family, but the exposure of a system in which power insulated atrocity until it grew too large to be ignored. The trial may have punished the guilty, but for those left behind, no punishment was enough. Their loved ones were gone, their remains desecrated, their identities dissolved into a ledger that saw them not as people, but as specimens. The Tallowby chamber, once a place of concealment, had become a monument to absence, a place where countless families could never know for certain if their missing were among the bones. And in that uncertainty, grief found no closure, only an endless echo. Though the trial ended with sentences passed and the manor locked under official seal, the shadow of the Tallowby Ossuary did not fade. If anything, it grew. What had once been whispers exchanged over ale or muttered in the corners of churches became legend, etched into the cultural fabric of Somerset and beyond. For locals, the estate became a place of dread. Farmers refused to till the soil near its walls, claiming nothing but weeds would grow there. Shepherds would drive their flocks along longer routes to avoid the grounds. Children were warned never to play near the crumbling gates. The rhyme that once taunted, "The Tallowbys keep you, bone and sack," became a nursery warning whispered with real fear. Some even believed the estate was cursed, that the restless spirits of the desecrated dead haunted its halls, rattling chains of finger bones against the walls at night. Yet for others, the very horror that repelled the locals drew outsiders closer. By the early 20th century, journalists, scholars, and morbid thrill-seekers began arriving to see the House of Bones. Some came with serious intent, determined to study what they framed as a rare example of aristocratic depravity. Others came for spectacle, daring one another to press ears to the cellar doors or steal loose stones from the foundation as grisly souvenirs. This gave birth to one of the earliest examples of what we now call dark tourism. Guides from nearby towns, eager to profit, began offering clandestine tours of the estate grounds. For a coin, they would lead visitors along paths where villagers claimed to have heard the rattling of bones, or point out the orchard soil rumored to hide shallow graves. Some guides even claimed to smuggle travelers into the manor itself, though whether these tales were true or mere bravado remains uncertain. Folklore flourished alongside this macabre curiosity. Stories multiplied that Lady Eleanor's spirit still walked the eastern wing, her veil trailing along the flagstones, that the missing grandson Richard returned in secret, adding new bones to the walls each year, that on stormy nights the ossuary chamber itself groaned, as though the bones within remembered their torment. These tales blurred fact and imagination, weaving horror into myth. By mid-century, the estate had fallen into ruin. Ivy consumed its towers, the roof sagged, and the locked doors to the cellars were swallowed by collapse. But the legend endured. During the Second World War, soldiers stationed nearby told stories of hearing clattering sounds from the ruins at night. In the 1960s, amateur ghost hunters claimed to record unexplained noises near the foundations. Low thuds, hollow knocks, and faint rattles that they swore could not have come from wind or stone. The academic world, too, could not resist. Anthropologists published articles on the Tallowbys as a case study in ritualized desecration. Psychologists cited Lady Eleanor's writings as evidence of obsessive-compulsive pathology elevated to ideology. Folklorists noted how the story had entered local identity, shaping the way generations regarded aristocracy, death, and power. Yet alongside these scholarly pursuits persisted something darker: fascination. Books and penny dreadfuls romanticized the ossuary, painting Eleanor as a Gothic villainess, half sorceress and half queen of bones. Tourists came not to mourn the dead, but to marvel at the grotesque, to feel the thrill of standing where human remains had once been displayed like trophies. The suffering of the victims became spectacle, their grief translated into ghost stories and gory illustrations. For the people of Somerset, this commodification added insult to injury. Families of the missing bristled at outsiders treating their tragedies as entertainment, yet there was little they could do. The ossuary, once a private chamber hidden beneath the manor, had become public property, not in ownership, but in legend. And legends, once loosed, cannot be sealed again. The legacy of the Tallowby ossuary lingers even now. In the crumbling ruins of the estate, where ivy strangles stone and owls nest in broken rafters, locals still refuse to walk after dusk. Tourists still arrive with cameras and lanterns, hoping to glimpse some trace of the bones that once filled those walls. And scholars still debate whether the Tallowbys were monsters, madmen, or something more chilling, ordinary humans who convinced themselves that collecting bones was a path to eternity. In the end, the Tallowbys achieved a kind of immortality, not in the permanence of bone, but in the permanence of story, a legacy no less enduring and far more terrifying. The story of the Tallowby ossuary does not end with the trial or with the collapse of the manor into ruin. It lingers, because it forces a question that refuses to be neatly answered. Why? Why did a family of wealth and privilege, heirs to centuries of nobility, turn their inheritance into a mausoleum? Why transform human remains into trophies, relics, and ornaments? What drove Lady Eleanor and her heirs to view bones not as a reminder of life lost, but as objects to be possessed, catalogued, and displayed? The simplest answer is madness. It is easy to consign Eleanor Tallowby to the ranks of the insane, to write her off as a woman broken by grief after her husband's death, whose mind twisted sorrow into obsession. Certainly her writings reveal traits we would now describe as pathological, compulsions, fixations, a rationalization that transformed atrocity into philosophy. To many, that diagnosis is enough. She was mad, the family indulged her madness, end of story. But such an explanation is also comforting, perhaps too comforting. It allows us to push the Tallowbys to the margins of humanity, to declare them monsters rather than people. And yet, when we look more closely at their actions, when we study Eleanor's words, what emerges is not incoherent ravings, but a structured world view. She was not babbling in delusion. She was writing manifestos, crafting essays, laying down a philosophy of bone as calmly as one might write about politics or art. That calmness is what unsettles, because it suggests not madness, but conviction. And conviction, however twisted, has always driven human history. Across cultures and centuries, bones have carried power, skulls displayed on battlements as warnings, saints' relics preserved in gilded reliquaries kissed by pilgrims, collections of anatomical remains in universities, justified as science. Even today, ossuaries stand as tourist attractions, from the Sedlec Chapel in the Czech Republic to the catacombs beneath Paris. We walk among bones with fascination as much as horror. The Tallowbys, then, may not have been as alien as we wish to believe. Perhaps they were simply an aristocratic exaggeration of impulses humanity has always harbored, to deny mortality, to preserve what should decay, to own what cannot truly be owned. Lady Eleanor took what cultures had done symbolically or religiously and stripped away reverence. She saw bones not as holy relics or scientific specimens, but as trophies, proofs of permanence, a currency of eternity. It is this mirror that disturbs us most. Because when we recoil from the Tallowbys, we are also recoiling from something we recognize. Our fascination with death, our urge to make meaning from remains, our desire to preserve. It all exists within us still. The Tallowbys simply pursued it beyond the boundary of morality, past the point where empathy restrains obsession. Were they monsters? Certainly. But they were also human, and it is in that humanity that their legend gains its power. Monsters are easy to dismiss. Humans who believe their crimes are justified, who commit atrocities under the banner of philosophy, are far more dangerous, because they remind us what people can become when conviction outweighs compassion. And so the ossuary stands, even in ruin, as a question more than an answer. Why do we fear bones and yet collect them? Why do we shudder at the Tallowbys but visit ossuaries and catacombs with fascination? What does our own curiosity say about us? In the end, Lady Eleanor achieved her goal of permanence, though not in the way she intended. She sought immortality in bone, but she found it in story. The Tallowby ossuary has outlasted her estate, her wealth, and even her family line. It endures not because of what it preserved, but because of what it forces us to confront, that the line between reverence and desecration, between fascination and horror, between humanity and monstrosity, is far thinner than we care to admit. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Tallowbys. Not the bones they collected, but the reflection they leave us with. That eternity is not found in what we keep, but in the questions we cannot silence.